The morning sun painted the red rocks of northern Arizona in shades of gold, but Joseph felt no warmth from its light. He walked slowly toward the small hill behind his family's hogan, carrying a bundle of sage and cedar in his weathered hands. Each step felt heavy, like his boots were filled with stones. 3 days had passed since they buried his baby boy. 3 days since the world had turned gray and quiet. The little grave was still fresh, the earth dark and loose where they had said their final goodbye. Joseph knelt beside the small mound, his knees pressing into the cold ground. The silence around him was broken only by the distant bleating of sheep and the whisper of wind through the juniper trees. His son had been just 8 months old. 8 months of tiny fingers wrapped around Joseph's thumb, of sleepy smiles in the morning, of hope for the future. The boy had gotten sick with the fever that swept through the reservation that winter. So many children had been taken. So many families were grieving just like his. Joseph's wife, Maria, hadn't been the same since. She used to hum while she worked, weaving beautiful blankets on her loom. Now she sat silent for hours, staring at nothing. When she did speak, her voice was barely a whisper. Last night, he had found her holding the tiny cradleboard she had made for their son. Rocking back and forth like the baby was still there, the grief felt like a weight pressing down on his chest, making it hard to breathe. Joseph had always been strong. He had survived the long walk when he was just a boy, forced to march hundreds of miles from his ancestral home to the prison camp at Bosque Redondo. He had watched his grandfather die on that terrible journey. He had lived through years of hunger and sickness in that barren place before the government finally let his people return home. But losing his child felt different, harder somehow. It was one thing to suffer because of what other people did to you. It was another thing entirely to lose what you loved most and have no one to blame, no way to fight back. Joseph pulled the sage from his bundle and lit it with a match. The sweet smoke rose into the morning air, carrying his prayers upward. He spoke quietly in Navajo, telling his son's spirit about the sheep, about his mother, about how much they missed him. He promised to take care of Maria, to be strong for both of them. As he stood to leave, something caught his eye across the valley. Smoke was rising from the white settler's cabin about a mile away. The family had moved there just 6 months ago, clearing a patch of land near the creek to build their home. Joseph had seen them in town a few times, a man with a thick beard, his wife with light hair, and their little girl who couldn't be much older than his son had been, his people, and the white settlers mostly kept to themselves. There had been trouble in other parts of the territory, fights over water and grazing land. Some of the older men in Joseph's clan said the whites couldn't be trusted, that they would take everything if given the chance. Joseph understood their anger. His people had been promised this land was theirs forever, but more settlers arrived. Every month, still, he felt no hatred toward the family across the valley. They seemed to be working hard, trying to make a life just like everyone else. The man had nodded politely when they passed in town. The woman had smiled at Maria once, and for just a moment, Maria had smiled back. Joseph walked back toward his home, where Maria was grinding corn for their morning meal. She worked with mechanical movements, her face blank. He wanted to comfort her, to find words that would ease her pain, but what could he say? Their son was gone, and no words would bring him back. Their hogan felt too quiet without the sounds of their baby. No crying, no cooing, no tiny breathing in the night. Joseph had built a cradle from cottonwood, spent weeks carving and sanding until it was perfect. Now it sat empty in the corner, covered with one of Maria's blankets, because neither of them could bear to look at it. The other families in their small community had been kind, bringing food and offering prayers. His sister had come to help with the cooking and cleaning, but everyone dealt with grief in their own way. And Joseph knew he and Maria had to find their own path through this darkness. He thought about his grandfather's teachings, the stories about how sorrow and joy were both part of the great circle of life. The earth takes our loved ones back, the old man used to say, but their spirits remain with us always. When you feel the wind on your face, that is them touching you. When you hear the cry of the hawk, that is them calling your name. Joseph wanted to believe those words, but right now the wind just felt cold. And the hawk sounded lonely. As the day wore on, he tried to focus on the work that needed doing. The sheep required tending, and there were repairs needed on the winter. Shelter, keeping busy helped, but the sadness followed him like a shadow. Every time he saw other children playing, every time he passed the little grave, the loss hit him fresh. That evening, as purple shadows filled the valley and the first stars appeared, Joseph sat outside his home and watched the lights in the settler's cabin across the way. He could imagine the family inside, maybe sharing their supper, the little girl chattering about her day. The thought brought both comfort and pain. Comfort that life continued, that other children were safe and happy, and pain because his own child would never have those moments. Maria came and sat beside him without speaking. They often sat like this now, sharing their silence. Sometimes she would lean against his shoulder, and he would put his arm around her. Tonight she stayed just close enough that he could feel her warmth. "I keep thinking I hear him crying," she finally whispered. "In the night I wake up thinking he needs me." Joseph nodded. He had experienced the same thing, phantom cries that pulled him from sleep, the instinct to check on a child who was no longer there. "Maybe that's him telling us he's still with us," Joseph said softly. "Maybe his spirit visits us in our dreams." Maria was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I hope so. I hope he knows how much we love him." The stars grew brighter as full darkness fell. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its pack, and others answered. The sound was mournful but also somehow comforting, a reminder that even in grief, no one was truly alone. Joseph didn't know then that in just 2 days his life would change forever. He didn't know that his broken heart, still raw with loss, would soon be called upon to save another child's life. He didn't know that his act of compassion would bridge 2 worlds and change how people saw each other. All he knew was that tomorrow would come, as it always did, and he would find the strength to face it. For Maria, for his community, and for the memory of the son who would always be part of him, the grief in his eyes would remain, a permanent mark of love and loss. But sometimes the deepest wounds prepare us for our greatest acts of courage. 2 days after visiting his son's grave, Joseph woke before dawn to the sound of his sheep bleating restlessly. Something had spooked them during the night. He pulled on his boots and stepped outside into the cool morning air, his breath making. Small clouds in the chill, the flock was bunched together near the far corner of their pen, all facing the same direction toward the creek. Joseph grabbed his walking stick and headed out to investigate. Wild animals sometimes came down from the mountains looking for easy prey, and he needed to make sure his animals were safe. As he walked across the scrubland toward Canyon Creek, the sun climbed higher, warming his shoulders through his wool shirt. The spring snowmelt from the mountains had turned the usually gentle stream into something much more dangerous. He could hear it rushing and churning long before he could see it, carrying fallen branches and debris from higher up the canyon. Joseph had been planning to move the sheep to higher ground anyway. The creek flooded every spring, and smart herders knew to keep their animals away until the water calmed down in late summer. He made a mental note to build a temporary shelter on the ridge where the grass was still good. The sheep seemed calmer now in the daylight, spreading out to graze on the sparse vegetation. Joseph counted them twice to make sure none had wandered off. Satisfied that they were all accounted for, he decided to check the creek itself to see just how high the water had risen. The sound grew louder as he approached the bank. When he finally saw the water, he whistled low in amazement. The creek had swollen to 3 times its normal size, rushing brown and angry between the cottonwood trees. Whole tree trunks swept by as he watched, spinning in the current like matchsTks. This was definitely no place for man or beast. He had seen floods like this before, and they were nothing to mess with. The water moved fast and hit hard, carrying enough force to knock a grown man off his feet and drag him downstream. Joseph had heard stories of people who tried to cross flooded creeks and were never seen again. He was turning to head back to his sheep when a sound made him freeze. It was faint at first, almost lost in the roar of the water, but unmistakable once he heard it clearly. A woman was screaming. The sound came from downstream, where the creek curved around a bend near the settler's cabin. Joseph dropped his walking stick and ran toward the sound, his boots slipping on the rocky ground. The screaming continued, desperate and terrified, the kind of sound that made your blood run cold. As he rounded the bend, he saw her. The settler woman stood on the bank about 50 yards away, pointing at the water and crying out words he couldn't quite understand over the noise of the flood. Her light hair had come loose from its bun and whipped around her face in the wind. Joseph ran faster, his lungs burning as he covered the distance between them. As he got closer, he could see what had her so panicked. About 20 yards downstream, from where she stood, a tiny head bobbed in and out of the churning water. A child. A baby. The woman turned when she heard his footsteps, and her eyes went wide when she saw him approaching. For a split second, Joseph wondered if she would trust him, if the tension between their peoples would make her refuse his help, but desperation erased all those concerns. "Please," she gasped, pointing at the water. "My daughter, she fell in. I can't swim." Joseph looked at the creek and felt his stomach drop. The child was already far from the bank, being carried quickly downstream by the powerful current. Her little arms flailed weakly above the surface, and every few seconds she disappeared completely under the brown water before popping back up. "How long?" he asked quickly. "Just now," the woman said, sobbing. "She was playing by that log while I was unpacking our lunch. I turned around for just a second, and she was gone." Joseph could see the fallen cottonwood she was talking about now, partially submerged and acting like a dam that made the water even more turbulent. The baby must have crawled too close and slipped on the muddy bank. His mind raced as he calculated distances and currents. The child was moving fast, but there was a chance he could catch up if he entered the water downstream and let the current help carry him to her. It was dangerous. The creek was full of rocks and debris that could knock him unconscious or pin him underwater. But without help, the baby would be dead within minutes. "Where's your husband?" Joseph asked, already pulling off his heavy jacket. "In town?" the woman cried. "He won't be back until evening. Please, you have to help her." Joseph looked at her tear-streaked face and saw the same desperation he had felt when his own child was dying. The same helplessness, the same raw fear of losing what mattered most. In that moment, it didn't matter that she was white and he was Navajo. It didn't matter that their peoples had reasons to distrust each other. She was a mother watching her child die, and he was the only one who could help. "What's her name?" he asked, kicking off his boots. "Lucy," the woman whispered. "Her name is Lucy? She just learned to walk last month." Joseph nodded and studied the water one more time. The baby had been swept around another bend and was now out of sight, but he could estimate where she might be based on the speed of the current. If he was lucky, there might be a place downstream where the creek widened and slowed down, giving him a better chance to reach her. "Stay here," he told the woman firmly. "If I get her, we'll need dry clothes and something warm." "I have blankets in the cabin," she said, pointing toward the small wooden house about 100 yards away. "And my husband keeps whiskey for medicine." Joseph was already moving toward the water's edge, his bare feet slipping on the wet rocks. The creek was even more violent up close, full of spinning logs and chunks of ice from the mountain snow. Getting in would be like jumping into a wild animal's mouth. But as he stood there, another image flashed through his mind. His own son, still and cold in his arms. The feeling of absolute helplessness as life slipped away. He couldn't bring his boy back, but maybe he could save this one. Behind him, the woman had dropped to her knees and was praying out loud, her voice mixing English words with tears. Joseph said his own quick prayer in Navajo, asking his ancestors for strength and his son's spirit for protection. The water was shockingly cold when it hit his legs, and the current immediately tried to sweep him away. Joseph fought against it, using his arms to pull himself deeper into the creek while his feet searched for purchase on the slippery bottom. Within seconds, the flood grabbed him completely, yanking him downstream faster than he had expected. The world became a chaos of brown water and noise, rocks and debris rushing past his head. He fought to keep his face above the surface while scanning ahead for any sign of the little girl, somewhere. Ahead of him in that violent water was a baby who was depending on him to save her life. Joseph kicked harder and let the creek carry him toward whatever waited downstream. The moment the cold water closed over Joseph's head, he knew he was in trouble. The creek was stronger than anything he had ever felt, like being grabbed by a giant hand and shaken. His lungs burned as muddy water rushed into his nose and mouth. He fought his way back to the surface, gasping and spitting. The world around him was chaos. Tree branches whipped past his face, and chunks of ice from the mountain snow slammed into his shoulders. The roar of the water was so loud he couldn't hear his own thoughts. Everything was brown and violent and moving too fast. Joseph tried to swim toward the middle of the creek where the current was fastest. If he was going to catch up to little Lucy, he needed to move as quickly as the water would carry him. But swimming in a flood was nothing like swimming in the calm pools where he had learned as a boy. This was like trying to swim inside a tornado. A fallen log as thick as his waist came spinning toward him. Joseph dove under just in time, feeling the bark scrape across his back as it passed overhead. When he surfaced again, he was dizzy and disoriented. Which way was downstream? Where was the shore? He forced himself to stop panicking and look around. There, about 30 yards ahead, he caught a glimpse of something small and pale bobbing in the water. The baby. She was still alive, still fighting. Joseph kicked harder, using every technique his grandfather had taught him during those long summer days at the swimming holes. But this water was different, thick with mud and debris, freezing cold, moving faster than a running horse. His muscles were already getting tired, and sharp rocks hidden beneath the surface kept scraping his legs. The distance between him and Lucy seemed impossible to close. Every time he thought he was getting closer, the current would grab her and pull her further ahead. She was so small, just a tiny dot in all that rushing water. How was she still holding on? Then Joseph saw what was coming. About 50 yards downstream, a massive cottonwood tree had fallen all the way across the creek. Its thick trunk and spreading branches created a natural dam, forcing all the floodwater through a narrow gap on the left side. The current was already pushing both him and the baby straight toward it. If Lucy hit that tree at the speed she was moving, the impact would kill her instantly. Even if she somehow survived the collision, she would be pinned underwater by the force of the current pressing her against the trunk. Joseph had maybe 30 seconds to reach her before they both slammed into that wall of wood and branches. He stopped trying to fight the current and let it carry him faster. This was his only chance. The water swept him forward like he was riding a wild horse, rocks and debris spinning all around him. His chest scraped against something sharp, probably a broken branch, but he ignored the pain. 20 yards from the fallen tree, Joseph could see Lucy clearly for the first time since entering the water. She was on her back, her tiny face barely above the surface, arms moving weakly. Her eyes were closed and her lips looked blue from the cold. She wasn't crying anymore, which scared him more than anything. 10 yards from the tree, Joseph made his move. He angled toward the baby, using every ounce of strength he had left to cut across the current. The water fought him, trying to sweep him away, but he kept swimming. His lungs felt like they were on fire. 5 yards. 3 yards. 2. Joseph's fingers brushed against something soft, the baby's dress. He grabbed hold and pulled her against his chest, just as they both hit the fallen cottonwood. The impact drove all the air from his lungs. Branches scraped across his face and arms as the current tried to push them both under the massive trunk. Joseph wrapped his arms around Lucy and kicked desperately, searching for something solid to grab onto. His hand found a thick branch sticking up from the tree. He held on with a grip so tight his knuckles went white, fighting against the tremendous force of the water trying to drag them downstream. Lucy was limp in his other arm, not moving, not breathing. For a terrifying moment, Joseph thought she was gone. The same helpless feeling he had experienced with his own son washed over him. That awful knowledge that he was too late, that death had won again. But then he felt it, faint but steady against his chest. A heartbeat. Using the branch as an anchor, Joseph pulled them both toward the bank. It was exhausting work. Every inch was a battle against the current, and Lucy's dead weight made it even harder. His grip on the branch kept slipping, and twice he almost lost his hold completely. Somehow, he managed to work his way along the fallen tree until he reached shallow water near the shore. His feet touched bottom and he stumbled forward, still clutching the unconscious child. When he finally collapsed on the muddy bank, his whole body was shaking from cold and exhaustion. Lucy wasn't breathing. Her small face was gray-blue, and her body was cold as ice. Joseph had seen death before, had watched his own son slip away, but he refused to let it happen again. Not this time. Not when he had come this far. He remembered the old healing ways his grandmother had taught him. She had been a medicine woman, skilled in bringing life back to those who had nearly crossed over to the spirit world. Joseph laid Lucy on her back and tilted her head to clear her airway. The way his grandmother had shown him with a lamb that had nearly drowned years ago, he pressed his ear to her chest. The heartbeat was still there, weak but present. Water had filled her lungs, but if he could get it out, she might have a chance. Joseph placed his hands on Lucy's tiny chest and pressed gently, trying to push the water up and out. Nothing happened. He tried again, a little harder this time. Still nothing. Fear began to creep back into his mind. What if he was doing it wrong? What if it was already too late? On the third try, Lucy suddenly coughed and water came pouring out of her mouth. Then she coughed again and again, her little body convulsing as her lungs cleared themselves. Joseph quickly turned her on her side to help the water drain out. After what felt like forever, Lucy's eyes fluttered open. They were blue, like her mother's, and filled with confusion and fear. When she saw Joseph's face looking down at her, she started to cry, weak, shaky sobs that were the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. Joseph whispered, wrapping his wet shirt around her shivering body, "You're safe now. Your mama's waiting for you." In the distance, he could hear the woman calling out, her voice getting closer. She must have followed them along the bank, watching the rescue from above. Joseph stood up carefully, cradling Lucy against his chest, and walked toward the sound. His own grief was still there, would always be there. The loss of his son had left a hole in his heart that would never completely heal. But holding this living child, feeling her breathing steadily against him, something had changed. The darkness that had consumed him for days felt lighter somehow. As he climbed up from the creek bank, Lucy's mother came running toward them, tears streaming down her face. Behind her was a small crowd of people, other settlers who had heard the commotion and come to help. They stopped when they saw Joseph, this Navajo man carrying the rescued child, and for a moment nobody knew what to say. Then Lucy's mother reached out her arms, and Joseph gently placed her daughter into them. The reunion was wordless but profound, full of gratitude and relief and the kind of joy that comes after surviving the unthinkable. Joseph stood there dripping and exhausted, watching a mother hold her child close, and felt something he hadn't experienced since his own loss: hope. The first thing Lucy's mother did after taking her daughter back was collapse to her knees right there in the mud. She held Lucy so tight it seemed like she might never let go, tears streaming down her face as she whispered, "Thank you," over and over again. The little girl was still coughing up creek water, but her color was getting better, and she had stopped that terrible shivering. Joseph stood there dripping wet, unsure what to do next. His whole body ached from the fight with the current, and there were cuts on his arms and face from the rocks and branches. But seeing Lucy safe in her mother's arms made every scrape worth it. The other settlers who had gathered kept looking between him and the rescued child, like they couldn't quite believe what they had witnessed. An older man with gray whiskers finally stepped forward and extended his hand. "Name's Robert," he said simply. "That was the bravest thing I've ever seen anyone do." Joseph shook the offered hand, surprised by the firm grip and the genuine warmth in the man's eyes. "Joseph," he replied quietly, "we owe you a debt we can never repay," Lucy's mother said, looking up at him through her tears. "You risked everything for a stranger's child." "No parent should lose their baby," Joseph said softly, and something in his voice made her study his face more carefully. She saw the deep sadness there, the fresh grief that hadn't quite healed, and she understood without him having to explain. "You've lost a child too," she said gently. It wasn't a question. Joseph nodded once, unable to speak. The woman, who introduced herself as Helen, insisted that Joseph come back to their cabin to get warm and dry. "It's the least we can do," she said. "You'll catch your death walking home in those wet clothes." Joseph wanted to refuse. He needed to get back to his sheep, back to Maria, back to the familiar comfort of his own world. But something in Helen's face, a desperate need to do something, anything, to show her gratitude, made him nod his agreement. The cabin was small but clean, with handmade furniture and colorful quilts that reminded Joseph of his own home. Helen immediately set about, heating water for coffee and finding dry clothes that might fit him. Her husband Tom had returned from town just as they arrived, and after hearing what happened, he couldn't stop shaking Joseph's hand and slapping him on the back. While Joseph changed into dry clothes behind a curtain, he could hear Helen and Tom talking quietly about how to properly thank him. They were simple farming people, not wealthy, but they wanted to offer something meaningful. "Money feels wrong," Helen was saying. "Like we're trying to buy our way out of a debt that can't be paid. Maybe we could help his family somehow," Tom suggested. "Find out what they need." When Joseph emerged in borrowed clothes that were too big for him, Lucy was sitting on her mother's lap by the fireplace, wrapped in a thick blanket and sipping warm milk. She looked at him with those bright blue eyes, and for the first time since the rescue she smiled, a shy, grateful little smile that made Joseph's heart skip. Over the next few days, something unexpected began to happen. Helen started showing up at Joseph and Maria's home with food and offers to help. At first, Maria was suspicious and standoffish. Relations between the Navajo and white settlers were complicated at best, and she didn't understand what this woman wanted, but Helen kept coming back. She brought soup when she learned that Maria had been too sad to cook. She sat quietly with Maria while she grieved, not trying to fix anything, just being present. And slowly, cautiously, the two women began to talk. It started with simple things. Helen admired Maria's weaving, and Maria showed her how the patterns told stories. Helen shared how she had learned to make bread from her own mother back east, and she taught Maria a few techniques that worked better in the dry desert air. "I've been so scared living out here," Helen admitted one afternoon as they sat together, grinding corn. "Everything is so different from back home. The land, the weather, even the way the sky looks at night. When Lucy fell in that creek, I felt so helpless, so alone." Maria nodded slowly. "I know that feeling," she said quietly. "When my son got sick, I felt like I was drowning too. Like the world was too big and I was too small to change anything." They worked in comfortable silence for a while before Helen spoke again. "Joseph saved Lucy, but in a way you both saved me too. I was starting to think we didn't belong here, that we should pack up and go back east. But seeing how he risked everything for someone he didn't even know," she paused, searching for the right words, "it made me believe that maybe different people can live together peacefully after all." As the weeks passed, the friendship between the two families grew stronger. Tom started asking Joseph for advice about farming in the desert. How to find water, which crops grew best in sandy soil, how to predict when the spring floods would come. Joseph's knowledge, passed down through generations of his people, proved invaluable to the struggling homesteaders. In return, Tom shared his experience with tools and building techniques that Joseph hadn't encountered before. Together, they repaired the flood damage to Tom's fields and built a better shelter for Joseph's sheep. The changes weren't just practical. Lucy had become fascinated with Joseph, following him around whenever he visited and chattering away in her toddler language. She seemed to sense that this quiet man had saved her life, and she rewarded him with the kind of unconditional trust that only children can give. Joseph found himself looking forward to these visits more than he expected. Lucy's laughter reminded him of what his own son might have sounded like as he grew older. Instead of making him sadder, it somehow brought a bittersweet comfort. Life continued, children grew and played and learned, and maybe his boy spirit was watching over all of it. One evening, as Joseph was preparing to head home after helping Tom fix a broken fence, Helen approached him with something wrapped in cloth. "I want you to have this," she said, unfolding the fabric to reveal a small wooden cross on a simple cord. It belonged to my grandmother. She always said it would protect the people she loved. Joseph looked at the cross, understanding the significance of the gift. Helen was offering him something precious from her own faith, her own family history. In his culture, such gifts carried deep meaning and responsibility. "I can't take this," he said gently. "It belongs with your family. You are family now," Helen said simply. "What you did for Lucy, the way you've helped us learn to live in this place, that makes you family. Besides," she added with a small smile, "I think your son's spirit and my grandmother's would have gotten along just fine." Joseph felt tears prick at his eyes. He accepted the cross and carefully placed it around his neck, where it settled next. To the turquoise pendant his own grandmother had given him years ago. Two faiths, two cultures resting together over his heart that night. As he walked home under a sky full of stars, Joseph realized something had shifted inside him. The grief was still there, would always be there, but it no longer felt like a weight dragging him down. Instead, it felt like a bridge connecting him to other people's pain, making him more able to help, more willing to reach across the differences that usually kept people apart. Maria was waiting for him when he got home, and for the first time in weeks she was humming while she worked at her loom. She looked up when he entered and actually smiled. "Helen brought us some of her bread today," she said, "and she's teaching me to write my name in English. I thought maybe I'd like to learn more." Joseph sat beside his wife and watched her skillful hands work the colorful threads into patterns that told the stories of their people. Soon, he thought, those patterns might include new stories, stories about unexpected friendships and bridges built across cultural divides, stories about how tragedy could somehow lead to hope. Outside, the wind carried the sound of Lucy's laughter from across the valley, and Joseph found himself smiling too. Word of Joseph's heroic rescue spread faster than wildfire across the territory. It started with the settlers who had witnessed the event, but soon the story was being told in trading posts, churches, and around campfires from one end of the valley to the other. Each telling made the tale a little bigger, a little more dramatic, but the heart of it remained the same. A Navajo man had risked his life to save a white child, and, in doing so, had shown everyone what real courage looked like. The first change came at the general store in town. Joseph had always shopped there, but the interactions were usually brief and formal. The owner, a stern man named Bill, would take his money and hand over his goods without much conversation. But the Saturday after the rescue, when Joseph walked in to buy supplies, Bill came around from behind the counter with his hand extended. "Joseph," he said warmly, "I heard what you did for the Mitchell family. That took real heart." Other customers in the store turned to look, and instead of the suspicious stares Joseph was used to receiving, he saw nods of respect and genuine smiles. An elderly woman touched his arm gently as she passed and whispered, "Bless you, son. Bless you." The shift wasn't just one-sided. Back on the reservation, when Joseph told his story at the weekly community gathering, the response surprised him. Old Samuel, one of the tribal elders who had always been the most vocal about keeping distance from the white settlers, listened quietly to every word. "You did good," Samuel said when Joseph finished. "That child's mother will never forget what you did, neither will their people. Sometimes the best way to protect our own is to show others who we really are." As spring turned to summer, more changes began to ripple outward from that single act of compassion. Other settler families started reaching out to their Navajo neighbors, asking for help with problems they couldn't solve alone. How to find water in the dry season, which plants were safe to eat. How to read the signs that warned of flash floods. The Navajo, seeing that some of the newcomers were genuinely trying to learn and respect the land, began to share their knowledge more freely. Trading relationships developed. Friendships formed. Children who had been taught to fear each other started playing together at the market in town. Helen became something of an unofficial ambassador between the two communities. She organized a gathering where Navajo and settler families could meet. In a relaxed setting, sharing food and stories. Maria came reluctantly at first, still shy around so many strangers, but she brought one of her beautiful blankets to display. "This pattern tells the story of the seasons," she explained to a small group of settler women. "See how the colors change from dark to light? That's winter turning to spring, death becoming life again." One of the women, a young mother named Claire, traced the intricate design with her finger. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "I lost my first baby last winter, and looking at this, it gives me hope that good things can come after the dark times." Maria nodded, understanding immediately. "Grief makes us sisters," she said simply. And suddenly the language barrier and cultural differences didn't seem to matter anymore. Meanwhile, Joseph found himself becoming a bridge between worlds in ways he never expected. When disputes arose over grazing rights or water access, both sides began coming to him for advice. His reputation for fairness and his willingness to risk everything for others made people trust his judgment. "He's got the kind of wisdom you can't learn from books," Tom Mitchell told anyone who would listen. "He sees what's right and does it, no matter how hard it might be." The most dramatic change came when drought hit the valley the following summer. The crops were failing, and both settler and Navajo families were struggling to find enough water for their animals and gardens. Tensions could have easily flared into conflict, but instead, something remarkable happened. Joseph organized a community effort to dig a new well at a spot where the underground water ran close to the surface. Navajo men worked alongside settler fathers, sharing tools and taking turns with the heavy digging. The women brought food and water to keep everyone strong, and children played together in whatever shade they could find. When they finally hit water after 3 days of hard work, the cheer that went up could be heard for miles. But more important than the water itself was what the project had created: a sense of shared purpose and mutual dependence that bound the communities together. "We couldn't have done this alone," admitted Robert, the gray-whiskered settler who had been one of the first to shake Joseph's hand after the rescue. "None of us were. But together we're strong enough to handle whatever comes." Lucy grew from a toddler into a bright, curious little girl who moved easily between both worlds. She learned to speak basic Navajo from Joseph and Maria, and could often be found helping Helen translate when language barriers arose. Her very existence became a living symbol of what was possible when people chose to see past their differences. On her 5th birthday, Joseph gave her a small turquoise stone on a leather cord, carved with protective symbols. "This will keep you safe," he told her seriously. "And it will remind you that you belong to both worlds now. You're part of our family too." Lucy wore that stone every day, and years later, when she became a teacher herself, she would tell her students the story of the man who saved her life. She worked primarily with Native American children, helping them navigate between their traditional culture and the changing world around them, always remembering that bridges could be built between any two shores. The story of Joseph's rescue became part of local legend, told and retold around dinner tables and campfires for generations. But the real legacy wasn't the dramatic moment in the floodwater. It was the quiet revolution that followed, the gradual understanding that cooperation was stronger than conflict, that helping each other was better than fighting, that the differences between people were far less important than the things they shared. Joseph lived to be an old man, respected by everyone in the valley regardless of their background. When he finally passed away peacefully in his sleep at age 78, his funeral was attended by hundreds of people from both communities. Helen, now a grandmother herself, spoke at the service. "Joseph saved my daughter's life," she said, her voice strong despite her tears. "But what he really saved was all of us. He showed us how to see each other as human beings first, everything else second. That lesson changed this whole valley, and it's a lesson we need to keep passing on." Maria, though frail with age, managed to stand and add her own words. "My husband always said that grief can make you bitter or it can make you kind. He chose kindness even when his heart was broken. That choice changed everything." As the years passed and the old tensions between Native Americans and settlers evolved into new challenges and opportunities, people in the valley continued to tell Joseph's story. It became a reminder that individual acts of courage and compassion could indeed change the world, one life at a time, The creek where Lucy had fallen was eventually bridged with a beautiful stone structure that connected both sides of the valley. A small plaque was placed there, not to commemorate the rescue itself, but to honor the principle it represented: in times of trouble we are all family. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the light slanted golden across the water, local people claimed they could still hear echoes of that long-ago day, the sound of a mother's desperate cry, the splash of someone diving in to help, and the sweetest sound of all, a child's first breath after being pulled back from the edge of death. Joseph's compassion, born from his own deepest grief, had indeed rewritten history. Not through grand gestures or political movements, but through the simple, profound act of one person choosing to save another, regardless of the differences between them.